Thank you. What a gift it is to be here. I think most of all, that was first of all, a wonderful statement, Brian, of what has happened and what can happen here. I have to say what I was most moved by, though, was our two student fellows and what they had to share, and remembering what it was like to be at their stage of life and learning. Forgive me, I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to put this so it will not tilt. Here we go. Nice horizontal surface. There we go. And just being so excited and moved to think that they have the opportunity to have this kind of experience in this formative time in their lives, and then to turn around and offer it in various ways as blessings to others. It's just very, very exciting what's happening here. I remember very vividly this time of year from my 10 years as a campus minister at a university that usually goes under a kind of veil of modesty when its alumni tell you where they went to school. They say, I went to college in Boston. And I would be fielding phone call after phone call from parents between the dates of April 15th and May 1st, whose children had been accepted, often to the great surprise of their parents, who really weren't sure that junior would amount to this much, had in fact been accepted against all odds to the freshman class at Harvard College. And these parents would call with a distinct anxiety in the tone of their voice, not just the anxiety of someone who is about to do the financial equivalent of totaling an SUV every year for 4 years in a row, but a more specific anxiety of parents who were deeply committed to their own faith, had in every way tried to raise their son or daughter in a loving relationship to God and as a part of the church, and wondered what in the world was about to happen as their child went to this notably secular and highly pluralistic institution. And if I had time in these calls, I would read them something from one of the most remarkable leaders in the history of Harvard, a man named Phillips Brooks, who never became minister to the university, though he was asked to do it, but he was a bishop and a pastor in the city of Boston, also author of the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. You may know him that way. A beloved figure at Harvard at the end of the 19th century. And I would read them this little note that Phillips Brooks wrote to a young clergyman who wrote him seeking advice. Phillips Brooks wrote at the end of his own life to this young clergyman about experiencing the reality of the presence of Christ as he grew older. And he wrote these amazing words. I cannot tell you how personal this grows to me. He is here. By he referring to his Lord Christ. He knows me, and I know him. It is no figure of speech. It is the realest thing in the world, and every day makes it realer, and one wonders with delight what it will grow to as the years go on. I love this expression of Phillips Brooks' mature faith, and yet not mature in the sense of having finished growing, but actually growing faster and faster, deeper and deeper. And I loved especially his, I think, ungrammatical use of these words, realist and realer. I don't think you're supposed to say that. I think you're supposed to say more real, most real. But he wrote, it is the realest thing in the world, and every day makes it realer. I like that. And I would say to these parents, I would love to introduce you to some of our seniors in our campus fellowship, because what I've found is if your son or daughter comes to this campus and pursues Christ, at the end of their 4 years here, Jesus will be realer than he is today to them their senior year in high school. Because we saw that happen again and again, and it happened for me over 10 years of campus ministry. The gospel was realer to me at the end of 10 years than it had been at the beginning, against all odds, in a highly secular place, a very pluralistic place. It was entirely possible, just as it had been for Phillips Brooks, for Jesus to become realer and realer. I did not usually share with these parents because it was just dawning on me a kind of uneasiness that I felt nonetheless about our campus ministry for all the amazing things that God did in our midst. We were very good at introducing students to a personal devotional life with Christ and giving them the resources they needed as they left home, as James so beautifully said, and started to become adults, newly minted adults, and actually take up the burden and delight of relating themselves to their Maker in prayer and study. We were pretty good at giving them that personal life of prayer and study. We were able to invite them into a rich Christian community because the Christian faith is not meant to be lived alone or as an individual. It's meant to be lived together, and by the grace of God, we were able to invite people into life together. And then in this environment of profound privilege, indeed extraordinary power and affluence, we had developed the ability to call these students to use their privilege to serve the alien, the outcast, the vulnerable, the widow and the orphan in the biblical terms, the victims of injustice, the poor whom we would remind our students did not come to recruit at Harvard the way that the consulting firms and the law schools did, but to whom these students were responsible to use their gifts. So we were calling them to and giving them, I think, direction towards very good things: personal devotional life, rich Christian community, a call to use their privilege to serve. But here was what started to trouble me in my years of campus ministry. Those three things, a deep personal life of faith, a rich life in Christian community, and serving the poor, did not actually require you to total an SUV every year as a student. You could do those anywhere. Indeed, you should do those anywhere. And the one thing we were not very good at was explaining to our students and to their parents, and indeed to ourselves as campus ministers, what it meant that they were here on this campus at this time in their lives, in the library, in the lab, rowing on the river at 6 a.m. or out on the lacrosse field, in the dorm, these 4 years for undergraduate students, in this educational environment. What was it that the gospel had to say to this moment for them? And I was just beginning to discover that this was not just maybe our deficiency as a campus ministry, but that actually our lack of ability to engage these central matters that really would answer the question of why would you do this vocation of studying, let alone a lifelong vocation of research and teaching, reflected a wider failure in the church to develop a biblical vision of, first of all, culture, of what it is that human beings are doing that we in so many ways sum up and study and examine and advance in our universities. And then a biblical vision of calling, that is, what in this vast world of culture, all the many, many things human beings can do, from playing a violin to doing surgery to studying accounting to raising sheep, which one should I do? We didn't have a deeply biblical vision of calling. And then I came to believe we didn't have a very deeply biblical vision of power, of what it meant to take up responsibility in culture. And I started to feel that the world was, in many ways, divided between Christians who sought to grasp cultural power without really having earned it by service, and Christians who shrank from cultural power out of an understandable desire to not be tainted by the world, but then abdicated any influence in the wider world and really undermined the reasons that, after all, our students were in university, to gain competence, to gain training, insight, and wisdom, and a kind of character that would prepare them for the leadership that would inevitably come given the privilege that also accompanied their studies and their degrees. We needed what you have here: a Christian study center deeply invested in these questions, not neglecting the things that other campus ministries are good at, personal life of faith, rich Christian community, call to service, but that would engage with the life of our culture, with the questions of calling, and indeed with questions of power and faithfulness with power. And we didn't have it, but you do. Because a few visionary people saw that this could complete the witness of Christ's body in a community like this and provide opportunities that could not emerge any other way. And now, this is one of the most hopeful things happening at large research universities across our country, is the formation of study centers like McLaurin CSF that are offering these kinds of experiences. So in the 15 minutes or so that they've given me, in addition to the interminable time I've already taken, I want to say what I think is exciting about what's happening here at this university and in McLaurin CSF. And I want to give you 5 I's, 5 words that begin with I, because I like alliteration. I am an Anglican, but I have learned a lot from my Southern Baptist friends and my Southern Baptist preacher friends who have the spiritual gift of alliteration. And my first book was all C's. My book, Culture Making, was all C's, and then my new book, Playing God, is all I's. So I'm going to do 5 I's. 2 I's for what goes right at the university. What's deeply right about what happens at a place like this university and ones where I've spent my time. 2 I's for what goes wrong at the university, and indeed goes wrong in every culture, in some ways in every calling and with every use of power. And then 1 I, final I, for the particular calling of Christians in a world where so much does go right and so much does go wrong. 5 I's. And the first I is image bearing. Image bearing. This amazing idea that emerges out of Genesis 1 that has no real serious parallel in the other creation myths that were circulating in the ancient Near East at the time when Genesis was first told and codified. When God, the Creator, having for 6 days fashioned this beautiful world, which at every stage is called good, suddenly turns from the third person, let there be, let there be, let there be, to the first person plural, and says, let us make humankind in our image. And in the image of God, God created them, male and female. God created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, everything that creeps along the ground. And at the end of this creation and this blessing and this commissioning, God then says of the finished creation, now it is not just good. It's now, do you know, very good. Because the image bearers have arrived in the world. And the image bearers signal the very goodness and completion of creation, after which now the Creator can sit down on his throne, begin to rule and reign, because they, in a unique way among all creatures, can have this very complicated word, dominion over God's world. This is an uncomfortable word in the university, this heritage, the Judeo-Christian heritage of identifying the human calling in the world as dominion. And I think it's partly because we have confused it with domination. That even we Christians sometimes have thought that what true power is the ability to get things to go where you want them to go. To get creatures to behave the way you want them to behave. This is what every parent initially thinks parenting will be like. We'll get our child to do what we want them to do. We quickly discover, in fact, that this is not true power, or at least not a kind we can access, even with our own children. But think about the ancient Near Eastern context of this word, dominion. How could any pre-technological person have looked up at the birds of the air and thought, oh yes, I'm going to control them. I'm going to get them to go where I want them to go. The birds of the air flock and fly whither they will. Do you know what a murmuration of swallows is? It's like one of the best words in the English language, a murmuration of swallows. This massive flock of swallows that wheel and turn, utterly unpredictable, swarm, to use the words of Genesis 1. God created the world with which birds and fish swarm. And all human beings can do, if you're ever fortunate enough to witness a murmuration of swallows, you will not be able to control it. But you will be able to stand in awe of it, be overcome by it, be left speechless by it. Watch as these swallows whirl and turn and fly. Well, how could any Hebrew have thought, I will have domination over the fish of the sea? The Hebrews were not a notably seafaring people, you may know. The sea was where the Phoenicians went. It was where those people up the coast went. But Hebrews did not go out on the sea. That's where Leviathan was, all kinds of nasty, scary things. And yet, here's a Hebrew text. Let them have dominion. And here's what I think it means. I think it means something much more like responsibility for flourishing. The dominion is being given responsibility for flourishing, not responsibility to command or exploit necessarily, but a built-in desire to see the world around us flourish. I took note of this in a new way when I had children, and my children were very much like the dogs in the movie Up by Pixar, who are these dogs who in many ways have been marvelously trained by their owner, who's this rather eccentric inventor, and they're quite responsive to human beings. They can talk and they can do all kinds of remarkable things for dogs. But there's one thing that will completely confound their circuitry, and that's whenever a squirrel comes in view, the dog stops everything it's been doing and just says, "Squirrel!" That's what my kids were like. They'd be looking out the window, and suddenly a squirrel would come in view, and my children would be utterly preoccupied by the squirrel. Now, was this because they wanted to control the squirrel? Not primarily. This is the difference between them and perhaps a dog who has a prurient interest in squirrels, you might say. A vague, pre-limbic sense that it ought to go chase that squirrel and do something to it, though it can't really remember quite what or what it would do if it caught it. But the dog has this vague sense, I think I'm supposed to eat that or something. But that was not the case for my children. My children had no interest, to this day, no interest in eating squirrels, or even in dominating squirrels, getting them in cages. They actually wanted the squirrels to be out in our yard doing their squirrel thing. They just wanted to watch, and they felt a sense of responsibility. And I feel this too. I look out my window, I look at I almost just said my squirrels. The squirrels in my yard, and I hope they're doing okay. I wonder, I do sometimes watch them and I wonder, do you remember where you are going to put that nut? Are you really going to remember next spring? I have a sense of responsibility for the flourishing of the squirrels in my backyard. Not that I can do too much about it, but I watch them with real interest to see if they're flourishing because I'm an image bearer. That's image bearing. This is asymmetrical. The squirrels do not watch me in this way. In fact, one of the fascinating things about the different creatures in our backyard, the robins and the cardinals and occasionally the rabbits and the squirrels, they seem to take no notice of me and no real notice of each other. But we human beings take notice of the world because we're made in the image of the world's creator, and we want the world to flourish. And the first step towards flourishing is attention. The first gift every parent gives their child is attention, regarding, attending to, intending the good of. And that's what the image bearers at their best will do in the world. The university at its best expresses this human calling to dominion, not domination, just to attending to this marvelous world in which we find ourselves. And discovering that we humans are so constituted, unlike any other creature, so as to be able to actually probe the deepest reality of the world and find its deep beauty and coherence and a kind of dignity that leaves even the most secular student of any part of this world at some point in their career in an astonishing state of wonder. The Stanford physicist Andre Linde, along with a number of others, theorized about 40 years ago, I believe, the theory of gravitational waves. that at the moment of the Big Bang, the phenomena of quantum gravity would leave an impression on this universe that could, in principle, be detected if we could develop instruments sophisticated enough. And a month and a half ago, roughly, the BICEP 2 experiment at the South Pole was able to strip away all the noise we encounter in the universe and discover and confirm, almost certainly, of course it has to be tested and all, but really it was a very dramatic demonstration of the echo of those gravitational waves. And Stanford did a very brilliant thing. They sent the graduate student who had run this experiment to Andre Linde's house to tell him. He did not know that this experiment had finally confirmed his theory. And they sent a camera crew with them, and it's captured on a little video on YouTube. And you watch as Andre Linde and his wife, who are both theoretical physicists, react with the most beautifully childlike and yet also deeply discerning delight. And they begin to tear up, and they can't believe what they're hearing. And at one point, Andre Linde looks at the camera, and deeply moved, he says, "Let's hope this is not a trick." He says, "I always live with this feeling, what if I'm tricked? What if I believe in this," by which he means my theory of gravitational waves, "just because it is beautiful? What if I believe in it just because it is beautiful?" And he's just learned it is no trick. The universe is as beautiful as you imagined, and you, an image bearer, are constituted to be able to go to the heart of that beauty, theorize it, expect it, wait for it, build an apparatus that will find it, and then open up a bottle of champagne and celebrate it. This is what universities do at their best. They provide for this kind of flourishing dominion over God's world. Image bearing, the first eye. The second and third and fourth and fifth eyes will have to go by more quickly, but that's the most important one. I have to say one more thing about this. This is a great gift Christians have to offer the university. Christians can explain why we want to do what we do here. In a world that denies the image, that seeks to reduce human beings to an inanimate bundle of neurons and instincts, we can say, you were made for this. Your insatiable human desire for dominion and indeed flourishing are rooted in who you're meant to be and who you're made to be. Believe it or not, but it's true. It is that beautiful. You haven't been tricked. Now, second eye. Wouldn't it be sad if the image bearers created this flourishing, exercised this dominion, but did nothing to extend that dominion over space, that is, extend it beyond that initial garden, and through time, that is, beyond those initial human parents? Wouldn't it be sad if this just happened for a moment in history and at one place on the planet, and then it kind of evaporated in one generation? For flourishing really to be fully enacted, it has to spread through the whole cosmos, and it has to last through time. And when the image bearers create durable cultural patterns that endure intergenerationally, that transmit the best of dominion and flourishing over time and space, the best word for this is another I word. It's institutions. Institution is the way that sociologists and anthropologists, especially sociologists, name human patterns of dominion, of shaping the world, and ideally of flourishing, that last generation after generation, and that can be spread across space. So they last and they spread. This is not how our generation thinks of institutions. We're suspicious of institutions. But true flourishing requires institutions. If we all have to make this up, year after year, generation after generation, we're in trouble. But if we can build on what others have done, if we can hand on flourishing from generation to generation and hand it from culture to culture, then we might see something of the abundance for which we were created. There's a biblical phrase that I think captures this. It's the biblical blessing that you will see your children's children. The desire of the biblical writers is not just to have a thin veneer of flourishing at their moment in time and their location in space, but for that flourishing to be extended at least to the third generation. And in a way, you can define an institution as something that lasts for at least 3 generations. And that, I think, is a very good test of image bearing. Does it last? There are only a few institutions that have lived now for thousands of years, that have passed on various kinds of flourishing for thousands of years. There's really no nation states, at least in the Western world. Family, the deepest human institution. The church, 2,000 years, perhaps 200 generations or so. And universities. Universities are among our longest lasting, most durable institutions. And I think it's because they preserve a very deep and fundamental kind of human flourishing. They deserve investment. We Christians are not in the university just, to use the old metaphor, with a bunch of life rafts and life jackets to rescue the perishing from a doomed ship. I think a deeper reason to be in the university is to pray for and seek and work for its flourishing as an institution that preserves something essential of human image bearing. Now, if those were the only 2 eyes, well, I'd be done and you'd be grateful. But we'd be living in a beautiful world, the world indeed for which we were made, and the world which indeed will be remade. But in the meantime, we live with 2 other eyes, and I'll just speak very briefly to this. We live in a world of idolatry and a world of injustice. The biblical diagnosis of what went wrong in this image-bearing story is that the image bearers abdicated their role as the image bearers of God, and they made substitute images. Images which promised to them 2 things always. The first promise of every substitute image, every idol, is, you shall be like God. And the second promise of every idol is, you shall not surely die. Those are the 2 promises of every idol. You shall be like God, unlimited authority, and you shall not die, no vulnerability. And human culture, which was meant to be full of the fruit of the image bearer's dominion and flourishing, instead now is full of idols, which work at first, but then begin to fail. That in fact, rather than delivering all authority and no vulnerability, end up delivering all vulnerability and no authority. Almost every freshman in college experiences this. One of the vulnerable things about being a human being is that it's uncomfortable to walk into a room of people you don't know, like many of us did just an hour or 2 ago. And wouldn't it be wonderful if when you walked into this room, someone would hand you something that as you sipped it, that sense of vulnerability and awkwardness would just ebb away, and a sense of God-likeness would suddenly come over you, so that you would become funnier, other people would become better looking, you would dance better, you'd feel more at ease, more able to move in that room, you would feel like God, and you would lose that sense, oh, I'm dying here in this room. Why do 43% of college students turn to binge drinking? To be elevated out of their creatureliness and to be saved from their creatureliness. To be given a kind of ersatz authority and to be given an illusion of safety and invulnerability. Of course, that's the student's idol. The professors have a different idol. It's called tenure. You shall be like God, you shall not surely be fired. Or perhaps the idol is knowledge itself. The academy being full of people who at their most insecure stage of life found their intelligence was something they could use to mask and manage their deep vulnerability. The university is full of idols, and it is full of institutionalized idolatry, which is injustice. As idolatry plays itself out over generations, some people get to play God. They get to be all authority and no vulnerability. And others become stripped of their image bearing and become utterly vulnerable without authority. This is injustice. And the university is just as tainted by idolatry and injustice as any other part of culture. Christians should be surprised by none of this and threatened by none of it. We know this story that image bearing and institution building turned to idol making and God playing. But Christians have hope in the midst of this broken world because of the fifth eye, when God acted to restore the image in the incarnation. In the incarnation, the true image returns. The true one who reflects and bears the image of God comes into the world, bears all the suffering of the world, all of the idolatry and injustice of the world is laid on him. And he offers to broken victims of idolatry and injustice, and to perpetrators of injustice, and to makers of idols, the chance to be remade in his image, to once again bear the true image. And this incarnation, this intervention to restore the icon, the trustworthy image to history, its effects have lasted not just to the children's children, but they will, we believe, last in that ultimate biblical blessing to 1,000 generations, so far perhaps 100 generations. And so our purpose in the university is simply to bear witness that God has not given up on the image and has provided a way back to bear the image. So, bear the image alongside your fellow image bearers, friends at the U. Study with them, collaborate with them, celebrate them, open up champagne with them. Build institutions that will last long after you are gone. Invest in the great image-bearing institution that is in the university, and invest in institutions like McLaurin CSF that keep alive the possibility of a deeper hope and deeper truth than the university can bear. Name idols and fight injustice, but more importantly, name the true icon of the invisible God who has come into the world, and tell the story of the God of justice, the only one who can rescue us from our God-making and God playing. This is no figure of speech. Phillips Brooks again. It is the realest thing in the world, and every day makes it realer. And one wonders with delight what it will grow to as the years go on. One wonders with delight. That's the story of small but real things like the work of McLaurin CSF and the story of our lives. Every day, the true image, the realest thing in the world, is becoming realer. Thank you.